Okay, so welcome and thanks for joining us to celebrate Public Services Day for this discussion on the crucial role of public services in tackling systemic and underlying factors that underpin gender inequality. I am Rossella De Falco. I am the Program Officer on the Right to Health at the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Today, I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar, which is organized as a side event to the 50th session of the Human Rights Council, and it includes a strong economic, social and cultural rights angle. It is co-sponsored by GI-ESCR, Public Service International, and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. The speakers who have extensive experience in gender-related advocacy, policymaking, and research will be discussing what gender transformative services are, why they are relevant now more than ever amidst the crisis we are living, and what solutions and opportunities we have to push for public services that realize women's rights at international, national, and regional level. I am delighted to present our panelists. We have today Chennai Mukumba, Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Tax Justice Network Africa, who will be sharing with us her experience on financing public services with a specific focus on education services. Then we have Rosa Pavanelli, General Secretary of Public Services International, that will be sharing with us an interesting discussion on care and health with a focus on workers and labor's rights. Then we have Corina Rodriguez, member of the Executive Committee of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, DAN, who will be framing the debate. Before I leave the floor to our wonderful panelists, I will briefly introduce the context of this discussion today and give some housekeeping remarks. The context is that of crisis, environmental crisis, social crisis that the COVID-19 pandemic has been exacerbating. Amidst this crisis context, women are usually the one that suffer the most, the one that suffer the disproportionate burden of budget crisis amidst budget cuts, or they suffer from the worldwide privatization and commercialization of services, ranging from health to education to care. We have analyzed at GI-ESCR this problematic situation in a brief entitled From Gender Responsive to Gender Transformative Public Services, where we analyze how women bear the heaviest burden amidst the COVID-19 crisis. This is why we are here. We are here on the one hand to deepen knowledge of what gender transformative public services are. On the other hand, we want to find solutions and strategize together to find opportunities to enlarge the current movements pushing for public services worldwide and specifically also care services worldwide. We already have tools for that. Over the last years, movements around the world, grassroots movements around the world have collectively framed the Care Manifesto that aims at rebuilding the social organization of care, and the Global Public Services Manifesto, which is aimed at pushing for public services in all key sectors as a fundamental tool for the realization of human rights, especially economic, social, and cultural rights. These two movements and these two manifestos, these two collectively framed requests for social change have a lot in common. Both analyze how the inclusion of for-profit incentives in financing and provision of healthcare, education, care, all public services can impact negatively the progressive realization of women's rights worldwide. Both the CARE and the Public Services Manifesto emphasize the centrality of fair labor standards and the centrality of fair taxation to realize human rights to quality public services that include all sectors worldwide. Today's agenda will be divided in 30 minutes on knowledge and enriching what we know about gender transformative services. Then there will be 30 minutes dedicated to solutions and opportunities. And finally, there will be 15 minutes for questions and answers. Please ask all the questions you might have in the Q&A box that you find at the bottom of the screen in your Zoom room. After this introduction, I am pleased to give the floor to our first panelist, who is Corina Rodriguez from DAN, that will be framing the discussion, setting the debate, and talk about her work in the area of gender transformative public services. Corina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to keep this conversation going. I would like to start by saying why I think this conversation is so relevant. Rosella has already said some things about that. I think it's very important to highlight the trend to marketization and privatization of almost all dimensions of life that we have been facing during these last decades, that has much to do with the corporate capture of a global and national governance, and that has been transforming all the social fields, education, health, care, as new business opportunities for the private sector. I think this is the context that we are facing, and that is why it is so important that we raise our voice to reclaim for quality public services. Because what we need to reclaim finally is people over profit, as we usually say. And for doing this, we have two interlinked approaches, the human rights approach, as well as this gender transformative approach. So I would like to say 2 or 3 words on each of these approaches. What does the human rights based approach bring to the public services discussion? I think it first of all, when we talk about rights, when we talk about human rights, what we immediately bring is the obligation of the state to fulfill for these human rights. When there is a right, there is an obligation of the state to fulfill for that. And then we as citizens have the right to claim for that. So it is important that we understand this idea of the possibility we have to claim quality and sufficient public services to take care of human needs that are the roots of many human rights, like the right we have to access clean water, housing, health, education, care. I think even connectivity is now something that we can claim as a human right. And the human rights based approach also brings us some principles that should guide the design and the delivery of public services. The principle of universality, which means that everyone should be able to access quality public services, and universality comes together with identifying the different needs that people have in their different contexts. Universality does not mean the same for everybody, but it means that everybody should access exactly what they need. The interdependence principle, which means that we cannot think about public services as silos, but as an interdependent frame, and also the public service delivery should be aligned with the reasonable development pattern that allows for the state to deliver public services, and also the principle of progressivity or non-retrogression, which means that once the state delivers, it cannot go back. So we also need to be clear about the right we have to claim the state not to go back beyond what they have already delivered. And I think this human rights approach to think about public services also come together with the idea of a participatory approach to public service delivery, which means that people should be able to be very vocal about what they need, and that there also should be reasonable mechanism for citizens monitoring of public service delivery. And as I said, this human rights approach comes very together with a gender transformative approach, which is what we're trying to discuss today. And I would like to start highlighting, I think the title of this event is very proper. We talk about going from gender sensitive to gender transformative. So what we want to do is not just to highlight gender inequality and how public services can overcome or approach these inequalities, but what we pretend is to transform the very root of gender inequalities with all the intersectionalities, with socioeconomic inequalities, with race inequalities, race-based inequalities. So when we talk about the gender transformative approach, what we mean is that we want systemic changes, as Rosella was saying. We want to change the root that produce and reproduce gender inequalities and its multiple intersectionalities. So for this, what we need is to have it very clear that gender justice is the basis. So we want to overcome all these very fashionable economic arguments in favor of investing in public services. We want instead to put on the top the justice and the moral arguments in favor of overcoming inequality. And universal access to public services is key to undo the dynamics of inequality reproduction. So what is exactly what we need to transform, and I will finish with this. I think it's important to understand what is there that is reproducing gender inequality in an everyday life. We need to approach the fact that women are the last resort when the states fail to deliver public services. This is very clear in the case of care, and it was made very clear, as Rosella already said, in the context of the pandemic, how when state fail to deliver, women's and paid care work is there to deliver for everyday life reproduction. What we need to transform is the social sexual division of labor that concentrate women in unpaid work, but also in precarious and underpaid work in social services, even in public service delivery. We need to challenge the feminization and the precarization of social services labor, and also, which is also very much linked to the fact that in many countries, migrant workers, women migrant workers are the ones who deliver this kind of services. And how do we do it? And I think this panel today is what we are going to discuss. We have tools, as Rosella already mentioned, and we have some good examples that we will be commenting right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Corina, for framing the debate in such an analytical and clear way. So I have a first question for Corina, and maybe if you can just quickly follow up on this question for 2-3 minutes, and then we will give the floor to other panelists. The question is, what are then the key barriers to the development of gender transformative public services from your opinion? So Corina, again, for 2-3 minutes maximum, and then we will go to other panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosella. I would say three things. The first one is that I think we still need to build a strong social demand for transformative public services. And for example, in the case of care, we still need to overcome, to dismantle the rooted idea that care should be provided in the households and by women. So we still need to face some very rooted ideas and to build social demands for this kind of public delivery. I think the second challenge is the dispute over resources. We need to challenge the austerity paradigm that is still very much there, and we need to push for tax reform that would help finance public services with a progressive frame. And I think the third challenge is the need that we have to reclaim the state, which means that we need to face the anti-state narrative that is prevailing in many of our countries. And I think there is also a challenge to reinforce democracy. I think we need to be aware of how much democracy is threatened in many parts of the world, and the need that we have to reinforce democracy in order to be able to build a strategy that is based on human rights principles. Thank you.
Thanks, Corina. I would now give the floor to Rosa Pavanelli, General Secretary of Public Services International, to ask the same question. What are the key barriers, Rosa, to the development of gender transformative public services in this context of COVID-19 and lack of resources for financing gender transformative public services, especially in the context of health and care?
Well, thank you very much, Rosella, and thanks. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Which are the major barriers to the development of transformative quality public services? I think that the major issue here continue to be the penetration of corporate interests in all areas and levels of the society. Corina mentioned the capturing of corporates over government. This is one of the themes that we are focusing on in PSI since many years now, because we see that this is the major challenge that we have, not only in order to make sure that there are enough resources to fund quality public services, to ensure that fundamental human rights, economic and social rights, labor rights are guaranteed to everyone, but also because what is at stake is the fundamental principles of democratic institutions. And once democracy is at risk or is undermined, it's also easier for all the conservative or regressive cultural movements, political movement, the right wing, to overcome the the social cohesion and the quality of our living together. Is there a problem of funding? You mentioned the need of resources to fund public services. Yes, we need resources to fund transformative public services, but in reality, the pandemic, while was showing the absolute importance of public services to keep alive our communities and to serve people, it also showed us that when governments are in need and when governments have the political will, they found the money to support the economy, to support the family, to give incentives. And also they found a lot of money to pay billions to the big pharma corporates in order to produce the medications and the vaccines that we needed, without taking care instead of make sure that those vaccines and those medications were available for all. We are still in the same situation. While the richest part of the world is about to get the 4th doses of the vaccine, in the global south, millions of people continue to be excluded from the access to, and women are the first to suffer of that, because they are, as Corina said, mainly involved in informal sector, working in informal sector, but also because we saw that the feminization of sectors like health, care, educations have been the most exposed to the impact of the pandemic. This is why I think we absolutely need to fight and to continue to focus on the campaign for a transformative idea of public services, which is key to build that economic, social, and gender sustainable development that is very much needed. We are now talking what happened during the pandemic, but we are in the middle of a crisis that is pushed by conflicts and war, and is particularly evident here in Europe, and it's now expanding with the need of supplying food also to the global south, without a fundamental role of the state to make sure that these quality services are accessible for all. The problem of poverty, the problem of discrimination will continue to exist. Corina mentioned the fact that we need now think that also connectivity has to be considered a fundamental right. I think that everything that make sure that we can have equal access to quality of life should be considered as a common that we need to protect and that the public has to provide. As I mentioned, we are in a crisis where now it's becoming even evident, while many start talking about famine around the world, that even food sovereignty, access to food, has to become a fundamental human right. It is actually necessary to survive. And here we also need to claim a fundamental role for state and government. So talking about the barriers, in these times is also for me calling to the need that we, as progressive movement fighting for transformative quality public services, need to be more engaged and more committed in claiming for a real disarmament, a real inversion of these policies that instead investing in armaments, will invest in the protection of commons, in the protection of natural resources, in another idea of development, which goes along with another idea of living together in peace around the world. And women have a key role on that. I think it's crucial, the role that we can play. We can play it within our organization, we can play it within our countries and our community, but also as public services, because public services were created to respond to the needs of everyone. We can see it now. Well, public services has to be accessible by everyone, no matter their status, if they are citizens, if they are migrants, if they are asylum seekers, refugees, and of course accessible to all people, no matter their economic conditions. So these are for me the major point. Last point I want to raise is that commercialization, marketization, privatization of public services have dramatically reduced the quality of working conditions and workers' rights, labor rights, and even sometimes the right to form a union and to collective bargaining. Defending workers' rights is not only creating in the public sector services, is not only creating the conditions for millions of workers to access dignity in their work, in their job. It's not only ensuring that millions of women, who are the largest part of workers in public services, can have decent work and dignity in their work, but it can also help. It can also help to make sure that even in the private sector, these rights can be ensured. In a nutshell, public services, the public can be the good example of working conditions and labor rights and ensuring quality of life for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosa, for highlighting also the dimension of the war, of conflict, and the positive role that the state can play as a good example. Within this framework, I would like to give now the floor to Chenai Mukumba, Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Tax Justice Network. Chenai, please, what are in your experience the key barriers to the development of gender transformative public services?
Thanks so much, Rosella, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak on this panel. So what I'd like to contribute to the conversation is something that preoccupies our mind quite a bit. As you mentioned, I work for an institution called Tax Justice Network Africa. And really what is central to the work that we do is how can we get more governments to begin to finance the attainment of their own developmental objectives. So we focus on how we can support countries through different measures to essentially finance their own public services. The reason we do this is because although there's other options to finance public services, whether you're looking at debt or whether you're looking at aid, for example, what we have found is that domestic resources, particularly through taxes, are some of the most sustainable ways of financing countries' developmental objectives. And the reason we have come to this way of thinking is because when you take a look at taxes vis-a-vis external sources of financing, you're able to then get a state to whom they essentially need to be more accountable to their citizens vis-a-vis external actors. So the extent to which, for example, countries are much more dependent, say, on debt, you tend to then get them making decisions that are based on the way credit rating agencies, for example, will support them. I was in a seminar just yesterday where, you know, the adage where they say, he who plays the piper he who pays the piper plays the tune. And the reason they were saying this was that whoever is responsible for financing governments is essentially to whom that government is accountable to. And so the extent to which we're able to get public resources to finance this development is the extent to which we can get governments to be more accountable to their citizens, is the extent to which we can get governments to prioritize people whenever they're making decisions, rather than, as has been mentioned earlier, other actors such as, for example, corporates. I think one of the things that we have seen as a result of the various crises that we find ourselves, is that it's particularly important for us to see the extent to which we can support and build capable states. I think it's increasingly becoming evident that countries need to start to look much more inward to finance their own development rather than outward. We looked at COVID, for example, where we didn't have capable states. We found states unable to provide for the most basic of human rights for their citizens. We saw states unable to provide health services, social protection, and even, you know, essentially provide mechanisms for their populations to still engage in the education sector. And so this is the extent to which we see the need for states to begin to use public resources to finance their different sectors. Your question, though, Rosella, I think speaks to some of the challenges that we encounter, right, in trying to address this issue. The work that we do has been able to identify these challenges at two different levels. So one of the first ways that we find a challenge for countries to be able to support their own domestic resource mobilization is through various issues that exist at national level. So often you tend to find at national level, states, in an effort to try and attract investment, for example, tend to give excessive exemptions and incentives. And the reason I use the word excessive is because in and of themselves, tax incentives are not necessarily bad, but often we have found states providing excessive measures to attract investment, which then results in resources that essentially could be invested back into the state, leaving that country. Another way that we have found a challenge for countries to generate resources domestically is through, and I think somebody mentioned earlier in this conversation, an inability to engage in progressive taxation. And so essentially, when we're taking a look at the way many of our states are raising revenue, you tend to find that our states, first and foremost, are focusing on a very narrow tax base. And so as a result, have a very narrow resource from which to tax. But also, secondly, whenever they're taxing, are essentially not targeting those who could contribute much more meaningfully. And so as a result, many of the states that we have are not taking advantage of, for example, wealth taxation. So essentially looking at how they can target high net worth individuals or, for example, corporates. And as a result, many of our states then tend to target those that are much easier to reach. And unfortunately, this has its most detrimental effects on women, just because when you're taking a look now at, for example, indirect taxes, women essentially are most negatively affected because essentially they, as a result of their purchasing patterns, spend a lot of their resources on consumption, on consumptive goods. And then also some of the other issues that we see at national level is just insufficient capacity of staff within some of our revenue authorities. And so essentially a lot of what we call for is to see increased support towards these revenue authorities. And so all of these are different mechanisms at national level that affect the way in which states are able to support their own investment into public services. Having said that, work that we do also focuses at the way in which the international architecture within which states operate also limits the way governments are able to raise resources domestically. At the end of the day, whenever resources are leaving a country, for reasons I've mentioned earlier, they have a destination. And these destinations are facilitated by an inadequate current global system that we have. And so a lot of what we have been pushing for is for decisions to be made at the global level to seal these loopholes. Unfortunately, a lot of where these decisions are made to reform the global architecture are currently being spearheaded in exclusive spaces. So for example, currently there's a discussion about reforming the global tax system, which is being spearheaded by the OECD. And unfortunately, many developing countries don't find themselves with membership within spaces such as the OECD inclusive framework, or they don't find themselves able to meaningfully contribute to those conversations. And so basically the point that I'm speaking to here, Rosella, is that states' capacity to mobilize resources domestically is impeded at two levels. Nationally, due to various decisions that states can make, but also at the international level, due to loopholes that I've spoken to, and an inadequate forums for states to be able to contribute to address these resources that are leaving. Unfortunately, when states do not have sufficient capacity to invest within themselves, it's public services that are most negatively affected. Specifically, you mentioned earlier that I'd speak to the education sector. The education sector is one of those that is most negatively affected. When you take a look at countries, for example, that are suffering from resources leaving their countries through, for example, illicit financial flows, countries that have high illicit financial flows only spend 42% of compared to all other countries on their education budget. So essentially what you see is this multiplier effect. Countries that are losing resources are spending less than half the amount that other countries are spending on their education sector. And this unfortunately has a gender dynamic sort of to wind up what I'm speaking to here. Unfortunately, as a result of, I mentioned earlier, the position that many women find themselves within society, they tend to be most dependent on the provision of public services by the government. And so the extent to which a government is able to provide adequate services is the extent to which women have access to adequate public services. So it is important for our governments to, number one, be able to mobilize sufficient resources so that they're able to invest into this sector, which essentially allows for women to be able to engage within that particular sector. So I think at that point, Rosella, I'm just going to pause and then happy to speak to a little bit more about this later.
Thank you so much, Chenai. It was really enriching to listening to your analysis of what are the barriers to establish gender transformative public services, especially from the point of view of revenue, of the generation of taxes and revenues, etc. At this point, we are transitioning in the second half of our debate. We analyzed the problem. Now we will look into solutions and opportunities. So to sum up, there are a range of barriers that make difficult to implement the transformation of public services into agents of change for women's rights. We talked about multiple interconnected crises, economic, financial, environmental, the COVID-19 conflict, but we also talk about lack of will from governments. We talked about corporate capture. We discussed private and commercial interest trumping the interest for public services that serve women. We also discussed how high illicit financial flows can result in less resources for the realization of public services for all women. And we also talked about an inadequate current global system of taxation that is not able to coherently monitor and regulate these problematic scenarios at national level, regional, and international. Now I will turn again to Corina to ask her, what are the solutions? The problem is complex, but let's think about solutions, both at theoretical level, but also in practical level. What can we do? How we move forward as a movement calling for gender transformative public services? Corina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rosella, and thanks to Rosa and Chennai for their contributions as well. Well, I think that there are some things that we can do and some opportunities that are already there. I think it's very important that we articulate all our resistances. In your summary just now, you mentioned so many different things, and we are organizing and resisting all those different fronts on global financial architecture, on taxation, on public services, on very specific gender matters. I think one thing that we need to do is really to articulate all our resistances and to push collectively for these systemic changes. I think it's also very important that we make use of the opportunities and that we support those very little windows that are open even by some of our governments. For example, I would like to mention the example of the governments of Argentina and Mexico that at the 48th period of session of the Human Rights Council, they presented an international declaration on the importance of care in the frame of human rights. So I bring this as an example on how some of our ideas and our agendas are penetrating even government's narrative, and that we should use these opportunities in a clever way. I also think that it's very important, and being from Latin America, I would like to also bring the example of feminists mobilizing and how really keeping on fighting and resisting brings good results. In the case of Latin America, I would like to bring two examples regarding care issues and care services. The first one is the example of my own country, Argentina, where feminism has been, I think, the most vibrant social movement during the last 5 years at least. And we have pushed so hard for the gender agenda, and especially the care agenda. And what was very relevant to make this claiming penetrate public policies was that feminists themselves came into policy making. In Argentina, we have many feminists populating key areas in ministries. And we are now, for example, the Argentinian government has very recently sent to the parliament a project to build a national care system, which is called, in Spanish we say cuidar en igualdad, something like care for equality, which means that it's a project to build a national care system with a feminist approach. So I think it's very important that we feminists, we put our bodies on policy making as well. And when we are not there, we support our colleagues and our comrades from the ground in their policy making. And the second example, just to finish, is the case of Chile. Chile is now discussing a new constitution after a period of social mobilization. And they had to call for a national assembly, and they draft a new constitution, and care is included in this new constitution as a right. And so if the constitution is finally approved, the Chilean government would be obliged to provide for universal care. And this was possible also because of the huge mobilization of the feminist and social movements penetration in this process of the General Assembly. So my point is that we need to keep on resisting. We need to articulate our resistances, and we need to support when some of us are there in the field of making decisions.
Thank you, Corina, for sharing this good news from both Chile and Argentina, and highlighting the care for equality system that was put forward from the feminist movement in these countries. Rosa, what are the solutions according to you? What are the opportunities, the good examples? The floor is yours.
Yeah, first, I think that one of the major positive aspects that we need to continue to push forward is the fact that now all the governments and the international financial institutions recognizes the fact that the international tax system is broken. Chennai just spoke about that. I think this an opportunity that we have, having recognized that the system is broken and is unjust, is just an incentive for us to continue to mobilize, to advocate, and to work in all national and international institutions that can help to address in a definitive way the situation. And this is key to bring resources, the resources that we need for transformative public services. Second, I think that we need to use all the tools that are available to help having more opportunity to address the issue of inequality. For instance, I think that Convention 190 from of the ILO is an important tool that we need to promote for ratification and for enforcement with all the government. Corina mentioned the good example of Latin America in terms of addressing the issue of care and promoting a different idea of care. Well, it's good to say that Latin America is top on the list of the continents that have already ratified the Convention 190. But this is something very important because it will help us address the issue of violence. And although it refers to violence in the world of work, for everyone, it also included reference and obligations of employers to deal with victims of domestic violence. And this is a very important tool for us. And finally, I also think that this is a good moment for us to fight for including care services within the area of public services. There are scandals everywhere about how privatized long-term care services have been responsible for more death during the pandemic, but also better treatment of workers and patients in general, and misusing of public resources that they receive, despite their privatized, to make more and more profit. Just to mention one case, the case of Orpea, that is becoming one of the major scandals in France, but not only in France, in all the 27 countries where they work, and Revera in Canada, for instance. So this is the moment for us to claim for retaking care in public hand. Because the evidence of scandals, of the way how privatization is disrupting the services is becoming clearer and clearer for everyone.
Thank you, Rosa. Grazie, Rosa. And we've now just discussed that we can achieve change by fixing the international system in terms of increasing tax justice, but also through norms and law, trying to increase adherence to the international law standards that we already have in the field of domestic violence, gender, and reclaiming care as a public health function, and reverse the current commercialization of long-term care. Chinai, what would you like to add to this debate in terms of solutions? 10 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Rosella. So I think it's been shown, in a whole host of different countries that when you're able to increase tax revenue, you can see increased expenditure in public services. So it's so important to see how we can address that issue of resources leaving our countries, right? And primarily sort of going to global north countries, which is where we tend to find these tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions, etc. So I think in order to address that, I'm going to sort of split potential solutions into two, national and international level. I think at the international level, as citizens, what we could be doing is calling for increased transparency from our governments, right, with regards to, for example, the tax incentives or tax exemptions that it's giving, for example, different multinational corporations. It's largely because of the secrecy of these contracts that many resources from our countries are able to leave. Also, as citizens, what we can also be doing is calling, and as I mentioned earlier, for much more progressive taxation systems, right? Requiring our governments to tax those who earn the most, essentially, who essentially have wealth, that, for example, is dormant and not using, rather than those, who are essentially living and working on a day-to-day salary, for example. At the international level, it was already mentioned, I think there's a lot of reform that we can call for. I mentioned earlier that many developing countries are not meaningfully participating in conversations about tax reform, yet we need to see more reform in order to benefit developing countries. The current architecture that exists was established over 100 years ago, and one can say that it's no longer fit for purpose. So, for example, I can speak to we've been seeing a lot of increased participation by developing countries towards this direction. On the African continent, just a few weeks ago, finance ministers, essentially in a resolution from a meeting that they had, said we need to start having conversations about having an intergovernmental tax body at the United Nations. As an institution, what we've decided to do is see how we can rally and support our ministers in that call. So we actually very soon will be putting out a sign-on statement that we are putting forward, not just as Tax Justice Network Africa, but in collaboration with other regional institutions that work on tax advocacy. So specifically TAFJA, as well as Red de Justicia Fiscal as well, essentially showing that there is solidarity by Global South countries to want to see reform, Global South civil society organizations supporting them in that event. So these are some of the potential solutions that I'd propose, can help us address the situation, because the extent to which we can tackle this issue of resources leaving our countries is the extent to which we can see increased investment on the part of our government into these much needed public services that, of course, has been mentioned over and over again, benefit women the most. Thanks, Rosella.
Thank you. We finished on time, so well done to all the speakers. Thank you. I would like to start by, there are some questions in the Q&A box. One is from Dennis. Dennis was asking, how do we dissuade governments that are dictatorial in nature and corrupt from offering the public services sectors to the private sector for profit maximization? Sometimes the leaders who offer these for-profit private services are incentivized by this mechanism of corruption, and it is difficult to work and to promote public healthcare services in a situation where these governments are dictatorial and corrupt in nature. So this is a very relevant and interesting question, really timely. Some of the speakers would like to answer. Feel free to jump in.
I think Dennis' questions is very relevant, and it reinforces what we said about corporate capture of governance at national level as well, and also about what we say regarding the undermining of democracy. So yes, it's difficult. In many of our countries, governments are not providing for people, but are providing for private sector and for their own benefits. And I think we don't have any other alternative than resisting this. And for that, I think it's very important, again, that we articulate our resistances. It's very important that trade unions come together with social movement, with feminist movement, with environmental movement. And I think it's also very important to count on international organizing in many countries for social movements at the national level. It's very even risky to act. So I think international solidarity and international organizing is also very important to tackle some of these obstacles.
Thanks, Corina. Definitely, we don't have an alternative, and also the private sector can be very corrupt as well. So it is about the choice. Some other speakers would like to take this question, or we have other. Rosa?
Yeah, thank you. On this issue, I think that transparency is very much important. And I would like to add to what Corina just said, that we are working within the ILO to promote and to have an international convention for the protection of whistleblowers, which is a fundamental tool from our point of view as workers, but it's important also for the society to being able to protect workers when they expose corruption in public services. And we perfectly know that where there is privatization, there is corruption. Is much more frequent. But I would like to add also something else, because it's true that many times this happens where there are dictatorial or not democratic governments, but we also need to say that even the so-called democratic governments are under the influence of a legalized corruption, because the actions of lobbyists even in big democratic countries, supposed to be democratic, can influence election. And this is the major form of corruption. They can elect presidents. Just look at the United States, many, more or less all states around the world are under the influence of powerful lobbies. And this is a form of legalized corruption that we need to expose and that we need to counter with our mobilization and the capacity to bring together all the democratic movement. workers, feminists, civil society, progressive movement working together. That's the only possible response in my view.
Thank you, Rosa. Chienai, would you like also to answer to the corruption question?
Yeah, I think Rosa and Karina really have spoken to it, but I think maybe just to double click, I think, so for example, some of the work that we do is, engaging in public awareness and campaigning, and the importance of that is because what we try to do is generate demand for the reform that we want to see, and the extent to which you can generate the demand. So for example, in our particular area of work, demand for tax justice, the more you start to see our leaders see that the citizenry are calling for a change, which if they don't speak to, could affect, of course, their much more short-term, sort of aspirations. And so I think the extent to which we can call for more increased transparency, call for more accountability, which is on the basis of, which can only be done on the basis of increased citizen awareness, that's one way we can try and tackle the corruption issue.
Thank you. We have another question from Mutaka from Nigeria. How can we address the challenges of outsourcing jobs in the public sector, which is precarious and involves more women? So the challenges of outsourcing job and precarity within the public sector. Someone would like to take?
Well, if I can answer how we can counter, well, we need to counter with the presence of organized labor within the working place. And what is important is to raise the alarm and starting mobilizing as soon as we have the feeling that outsourcing, that the administration is thinking to outsource services. Many times as public services, we are called to intervene by our members in the country, but when it is too late, when the decision is taken or it's about to be taken, it's extremely important being able to understand the processes that are ongoing within each public services and being able to organize as soon as we have this feeling, long before the news, the feeling is crucial to be successful in mobilizing against the privatization. And again, building alliance with users, with the communities, with the civil societies, with other workers as well.
Thank you, Rosa. Other comments from other speakers? Okay, we have another question from Alejandra, my colleague at GI. How can we connect feminists working in silos in specific public services on care, health, education to build a common cross-sectoral gender transformative movement to reclaim public services? So how can we stop working in silos as feminists across different sectors? What strategies can we use? I would start saying that this webinar is a great way to start. But what can we do next?
I think that it's also important here, the role of trade unions in order to bring these people together. I think feminists in trade unions have much to do in opening up these channels for dialogues between the silos. And I think feminist movement is itself broad and it's interconnected, and I think it's also very important that the feminist movement open up to dialogue and organizing with social movements, with the trade unions, and work very much in the field to make these conversations possible. But I think that open up these silos is very important, and trade unions, federations many times bring the space for this kind of dialogue and collective organizing.
Yes, if I can add something, is that it is to respond to the interest of private capitals that care, for instance, has been divided from health. In the past, particularly in Europe, when we were building the so-called welfare state, health and care were unique areas of work and were meant to respond to all the needs of a human being along his or her life. Having a holistic approach to the need of people, to the need of individual, is a possible response to break silos and to make sure that there is a human right approach that has to go through all the different spheres of the needs of a person and the rights of a person.
Thank you. Would you like to add something, Chie-Nai, to this question?
Again, I feel Karina and Rosa. But I mean, I think focusing on because it's a issue that I think is relevant across all the different sectors within which we move. I don't think it's specific to the feminist movement. So, for example, even us in the tax justice movement, we have the same issues. But what we've done is we've concentrated on the areas where we have overlapping areas of interest. So you'll find, for example, we work very closely with the feminist movement because we've been able to identify that, listen, tax justice can have a very, key role in contributing to promoting sort of gender equality, right? So focusing on the things that unite us is one way of seeing how we can increasingly collaborate across our work.
We have a final question about the inclusion of men within feminist movements. If you have an idea to share good practices in this area.
Well, I think feminism is regardless gender, and feminist is made out of feminist people and all the diverse gender identities. But I do think that there are good examples of men getting together to question themselves about their privileges and all the benefits that they have been having during cycles on the human history. So there are new movements of new masculinity. I don't know whether it makes sense in English, this idea of men that are questioning themselves. And I think that is very, very important to have more feminist men among the feminist movement.
Yeah, I would like to complement just with an example. In the 90s, within the confederation where I come from in Italy, CGIL, we decided to give up with the Women Committee because we thought that it was time to engage in the constitutional body of the organization along with the men. And since then, we started getting more and more power in the union at the point to elect even a general secretary woman. and more women leading different branches and federations. This is an example, but it's true that we need men if we want to make a real change. Change won't be possible without men that can share a feminist vision of the world, where equality is possible for everyone. And it's true, as Corinna says, that there is a multiplication, maybe not big organization, but more and more men joining in organization where they are questioning their patriarchal system and trying to propose different models. So these are natural allies.
Thank you. Any further comment on this topic? If not, as there are not any more questions from our kind audience that have been with us until now, I will just give some concluding remarks. I will be thanking our fantastic panelists and all the participants and the co-sponsoring organization, again, which have been GI-ESCR, PSI, and Global Tax Justice Alliance. We have been sharing a lot of very relevant documents in the chat. Please go through them and just stay in touch, connect to continue this conversation. And again, happy Public Services Day, everyone.